Well, this morning we're going to continue our defence of our God, who has been blasphemed by the sceptics and the atheists of this world. And they have largely infected the thinking of the world in the generation since the turn of the century. And we talked about them as the Four Horsemen and their anti-God books. Richard Dawkins' latest book is aimed particularly at young people. It's called Outgrowing God. And he's trying to give young people the excuse to walk away from any concept of a creator that would have any dominance in their lives. And we saw yesterday that what the tragedy of these skeptics and atheists is that they give people the reason to be whatever they want to be. Or as Romans 1 said, they do not want to retain God in their knowledge. And even though Dawkins cannot explain where DNA came from, suggesting on the BBC that it came perhaps from spacemen, because you just can't have it as a matter of chance. He admits that, and yet he says there's probably no God. Just get on with your life and enjoy yourself. And you see, that's the danger of this type of thinking. It actually gets God out of the picture, so you don't have any values of God accepted. And we saw yesterday that these are the charges they make against the God of the Old Testament. He's an angry, jealous God. He demands soul worship. He condoned slavery. He was racist in choosing just one nation to be his people. There was ethnic cleansing of the Canaanites and the Amalekites. And we dealt with those yesterday in some brief detail. And we showed you that when you approach the Bible from the point of view that you actually believe in a loving creator God, then you look at these passages and you say these passages were written for protection of people, not for racism or slavery or any of those things to be approved. They also say the Bible is weird. There are laws like the kosher laws about food and laws about birds' eggs. And you can approach those same passages and say this is a matter of conservation, that you don't take a dam with the eggs, that you don't cut down fruit trees, even in a siege, that there are health laws, that you don't eat unclean foods. So there were good reasons for those things that God gave in his word. The law is for your good always. And yet people approach the Bible and say the Bible's weird because they have laws about birds' eggs. And of course, the one we're dealing with today is God suppresses and demeans women. Let me just show you how the feminists treat the Bible. Religion is against women's rights and women's freedom. In all societies, women are oppressed by all religions. You know, a classic case of catastrophism where everything is particularly terrible. But then you go on to people like this. I strongly believe that no one can be a true feminist without being an atheist. There's a grain of truth in that. All religions are anti-women. No one can be pro-woman while supporting anti-women dogmas. And people like these have made their God absolute and total equality. That's their new God. Instead of starting out from the point of view that there is a creator, that we read the Maker's instructions to find out why we are here, what he expects of us, what he's like, how to imitate him. Instead of that, we start from the God which says we have to have absolute equality as the only thing that matters. And when you start from that God, everything else about the Bible and religion gets in the way. So we start from a different standpoint. We come at the Bible knowing what God is like. These people come at the Bible saying, we've already made up our minds what we have to expect, and if God doesn't meet it, then we reject God. This is a woman from some time ago. And she said this, I've endeavoured to dissipate these religious superstitions from the minds of women and base their faith on science and reason. He said, there's your humanist values. Where I found for myself at last that peace and comfort I could never find in the Bible and the church. The less they believe, the better for their own happiness and development. The Bible and the church have been the greatest stumbling blocks in the way of women's emancipation. And there is no way you can align radical feminism with the Bible. But does that mean all religions are wrong? Does that mean all religions are right? Most certainly not. You know, when Jesus came into the world, he was up against a hypocritical and self-righteous religion that had been developed by the Pharisees and the scribes, against the materialism of the Sadducees. And he also warned that there would be false prophets yet to come that would affect the brotherhood. And so we see the apostasy in many forms, not only in the Christian apostasy, but in the false Islamic system in the world. And all of these religions, all of them have things where they demean, mutilate and suppress women. It doesn't mean that any religion is right, but true religion does offer better values, better morals, and protection for women. And it's that protection I want to talk about this morning. What you're going to see, I trust, is that the laws that God gave concerning women, well, not only because in the beginning God had an order in place, but because God wanted to protect the vulnerable. And in most of the examples we're going to look at, that's what it's about, protection for women, not suppression. To the radical feminists, they will never accept that viewpoint. So here are the objections the feminists have about the law of Moses. Abraham being called Lord and Master by his wife. Only males could be priests. Girls belonged to the father's house. Baby girls incurred a double period of uncleanness for the mother. Girls could be sold to pay off family debts. Males could override female vows. As we said yesterday, one of the best ways to appreciate the value of the law of Moses is to compare it to the laws of the ancient world. But we don't need even to do that. We can look out at our modern, supposedly enlightened world, and we can see tremendous examples in other religions of the abuse of women. But the Bible wasn't like that. Let me just put down the principles that God laid out from the foundation of the world. Both male and female were made in the image of God and the angels. Male and female made he them. As Israelites, both male and female were part of the kingdom of priests, a holy nation. Godly women were active and held in respect and honour outside the home. You read Proverbs 31, the virtuous woman goes to the marketplace. She makes goods and sells them in public. She's very active in community life. How different is that to modern women? The women of Saudi Arabia have just been given the right to drive a car, but they have to be escorted. That's in the modern world. That's today. This is 3,500 years ago. And there were many laws that were designed to protect the vulnerable women and to make sure they were not abused. And we're going to look at some of those laws in detail in a moment. So they were the world's foundations. But the feminists would say, why were there no women priests? You know, all the priests of the family of Aaron were males. They likewise say that Jesus only chose male apostles. Therefore, they make Jesus someone who's oppressing women. But think about the priesthood. 99.99% of Israel could not be priests. Every other tribe but Levites could not be priests. Every other Levite but the house of Aaron could not be priests. You see, God doesn't believe in the principle of equal opportunity for every person. He says, I make appointments and I expect you to observe them. And when Korah challenged from the house of Levi the right of Aaron to be priest, look what God did to him. God said, I make the appointments and you have to observe them. So God's a discriminator, according to the feminists, but he discriminated against all the males as well. You see, this is the difference in the way you approach the Bible. And why not women priests? Well, God established a hierarchical order right back in the garden. Adam was first made, then Eve, says Paul. Adam was given God's law before Eve was created. And when the law was broken, God didn't go looking for Eve, he went looking for Adam. Eve had led the transgression. So God says, I'm going to make sure my divine order is respected. There will now be roles. There will be different roles for men and women to play. And it comes down to the head covering principle, as Corinthians builds on that creation record. But in matters of salvation, in matters of worship in Israel, men and women had equal access to the worship code. Other than being priests, every other aspect of worship women could do equally with men. And we're all one in Christ Jesus. We all have access to the throne of grace. But there are different roles that still have to be observed to honour the divine order. Now I want to show you how different the law of God is to the law or the thinking of the feminist movement. When you go to the ancient codes that were extant in the world at the time, in every one of those codes, fathers had to be totally honoured and obeyed. And that made for order in society. But when you come to the law of Moses, in the fourth commandment of the 10, God puts a very different slant on it. Honour thy father and thy mother. And that wasn't in the ancient codes that were extant at the time. When that's repeated in Leviticus, it says this: you shall fear every man his mother. And notice who comes first. And his father, and keep my Sabbath. I am Yahweh your God. And God's recognising here in Leviticus that it's the influence of the mother in those early years that is so critical to the development of the child. And in Proverbs, it's full of commandments to observe the laws of both mother and father. That was totally different to all the thinking of the ancient world, where fathers had all the rights, all the authority, and all the respect. But God's law had a perfect balance. Mother and father working together for the benefit and the spiritual growth of their children, and both of them being respected. And the mother is mentioned first in Leviticus. And if you assaulted your parents, there was a death penalty on that. But look who's up first. He that smiteth his father or his mother shall be surely put to death. He that curses his father or his mother shall be surely put to death. And when children were continually defiant for their parents, they would bring them to the elders, and that was also a death sentence for disobeying father and mother. And God's elevated the women against all the ancient codes that you find extant at the time. So let's come to Exodus 21. There will be some notes available to you with an exposition of this particular section. If anyone's got a comment, please help me with it, because I think I could still yet improve it. But we want to deal with this one, which is perhaps the bride price, they call it, which is perhaps the greatest weapon of the feminist movement. And that is that daughters appear to be sold to pay off family debts. Well, again, it depends with what mindset you approach it. If you want to criticise God, then you could say that's cruel. But you see, we're dealing here with a nation where there was poverty. And in cases of economic desperation, a father could place his daughter into service, so she would go into the house as a servant, with a view to marriage to either the father or the son. Now, there would be a dowry payment made to her father, so the father would be able to relieve the economic burdens he was under because of the dowry payment he would receive. And this was an arranged marriage. You see in verse 9, there was the mention of it being betrothed to a son. It could have been that the creditor would then say, look, well, I have this girl come into my house and she can marry my son. Now, we find arranged marriages something strange. When you've had teenage children go through those years of pairing off, you think it's not a bad idea. But here was a case where in all cultures, arranged marriages were the custom. In many cultures today, it's still the custom, and not always good. But surprisingly, historically, arranged marriages have a greater success rate than people choosing for themselves. And that's a fact which is quite unknown. However, it says there in verse 9 that when she goes into that house and betrothed to the son, she has to be dealt with like a daughter of the house. So while she's there in that house, she's not treated like a manservant. She can't be put under heavy burdens. Look what it says in verse 7. She shall not go out as men servants. So you can't put her out in the field and say, go out there and reap the fields. She's got to be treated like a daughter of the house. So here is protection for this particular girl in this situation. But this is here because people are fickle. A man might say, yes, I'll have this girl and I'll marry her, or my son will marry her, and then somebody changes their mind. And this is all about when the mind has been changed, what happens. So let's read verse 8. So in verse 7, she can't be treated like a male slave or a male servant. She can't be made to work too hard. But then in verse 8, they decide, look, after she's been there for a while, look, whoops, this is not going to work. So he's betrothed her. She can be redeemed. So her father can come along and say, look, here's your money back. I can borrow it from somebody else. I want my daughter out of there. So the father has the right to redeem her. But the person who's taken her on cannot on-sell her. He can't say, well, look, I really decided I don't want to marry her. I'll sell her to Joe Blow down the road. He can't do that. He can't sell her to another strange nation. Why? Because at the end of verse 8, he has dealt deceitfully with her. Now, we need to just think about that particular thing. In verse 8, where it says dealt deceitfully, the ESV has, he has broken faith. There's a breach of promise occurred. She went there thinking she was going to marry into this house. But now she's been cast off and said, no, we don't want you for marriage. So she's in a very vulnerable situation. So it says there that if they have dealt deceitfully with her, if they've broken faith on this promise, then she has a few choices. As it says in verse 10, if he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, and duty of marriage shall he not diminish. So she had to be provided, food, clothing, and shelter. If she was not provided for, in verse 10, verse 11, if he do not these three things, then she can go out with that money. She can walk out. She can leave. They're not feeding me, they're not treating me properly, I can leave. But that wouldn't be easy for a girl to go home. When everybody thought she was going to get married to this guy and now she's got to come home, it's an embarrassing thing for her. She might choose to stay. If she chooses to stay, then she has to be fully provided for. And she could not be sexually exploited. Now, the law was very clear about it. You can't abuse your handmaids. And it was never a matter of concubinage. God, either in the Old Testament or the New Testament, never approved concubinage, that you could actually add people on to the end of your list of wives. And it's so sad when dealing with this passage in verse 10 that so many commentators assume that the word duty here in verse 10 is the same meaning as the word duty you find in the 1 Corinthians 7 verse 5 of the responsibility in marriage partners to care for each other's physical needs. And they say, well, if it's a duty there, it's duty here, forgetting that it's Hebrew and Greek are totally different words. So what does it actually mean? Well, she was not a second wife or a concubine. The Hebrew word here is the word onah. It's the only occurrence of the word in the Old Testament. So when you get an only word, you think there's something very significant here. And it indicates dwelling or shelter. Some Hebrew scholars say it means oil or ointments. That's part of the origins of the word. So the needs of life have to be provided. Young's literal has for that verse, food, covering, and her habitation. The ESV has what she would have expected to get as her marital rights. The sort of life she expected to get as a wife. Should never assume that means that she just becomes a concubine. She must be provided food, clothing, and shelter, or she lets go free and the debt is cancelled. So this is all about a case where she has been dealt deceitfully with. She has been led astray by a false promise. And God is totally making sure that she's not abused and not just added as a concubine. It's all preventing about somebody being abused in a vulnerable situation. So the main object is protection of the vulnerable. When you come at it like that, it's a total different way of looking at how the feminist sees it. I want you to come to Deuteronomy chapter 21. I want to talk now about female captives in war. Deuteronomy 21, we're going to pick it up in verse 10. This is about the case where they go to a foreign country, perhaps Ammon, Moab, somewhere like that, and they besiege a city and they conquer it. And one of the soldiers sees a beautiful woman amongst the captives and he decides he would like to marry her. So we're talking about female captives outside the Canaanites. And some of these female captives, they could be taken home to become brides, but only the virgins. So again, because many of these nations were totally corrupt in their worship practices, totally immoral, God said, I don't want any woman that's been part of that. So a virgin could be taken home. You could not, what usually happens in war is that people are raped on the spot. That could not happen with Israelite soldiers. They could take her home, and she was allowed time to mourn her parents. Look at verse 10 of Deuteronomy 21. About this woman it says, when you go as to war against your enemies, and Yahweh thy God deliver them into your hands, you take them captive, you see a beautiful woman has a desire to her, if you would have her to be your wife, bring her home, she'll shave her head, pare her nails, put off her raiment of the captivity from off her, remain in thy house, bewail her father and mother a full month, and only after that can you marry the girl. So she's given time to mourn the loss of her parents and maybe her brothers that were lost in the war. But there was more to it than that. You know, God didn't want people to go and win battles and then, you know, as it says in the Bible, you know, the women will be ravished, as will happen in Armageddon in Jerusalem. That's what usually happens in conquests. God says, no, you can't do that. And for this woman, her city's been destroyed, her crops have probably been taken. What's she going to do now? It's going to be starvation or death or worse, so some other people might take her into captivity. So here are the laws. Here's a case of God protecting the vulnerable woman. God regulating behaviour. He didn't want people to go and take these wives. He said, I know you'll do it. I'm going to regulate what happens. And you're choosing this woman based on her looks alone. They don't know anything about this girl. They don't know her morals, her values, whether she's going to be amenable to the law of the God of Israel. They've chosen her on looks alone. So what does she do? Cuts her hair off, gets rid of all the fancy decorations. They look quite different, can't they? Diminishing her attractiveness on a physical sense. He's then got to wait a month. He's got a month to reflect. You know, in the heat of battle, it's often why these terrible things occur, because men are all hyped up and they're all full of adrenaline. When you've got time to think about your decision to marry this girl and you're actually talking to her and learning what she's really like, you've got time to think about it while she's in mourning clothes. And he can reflect on the wisdom of his decision. And he can back out and say, no, look, let her go free. If the marriage or the betrothal failed, she could go free and she could never be sold. See, God doesn't want slavery. He doesn't want women to be chattels. This was about protecting the woman from just being a spoil of war. And this is how great God's law was. You know, we have things like the Geneva Convention says that you can't use rape as a weapon of war. And it happens all the time. And no nations are ever brought to account for it. But God's law said it's not going to happen. Women will be protected. And even if they're spared their life and they become a wife in Israel, there will be time for people to consider the wisdom of that decision. It's a terrific different thing, isn't it? What's amazing, of course, is you get a case like Rahab that God spared because she had her own faith. She was not a virgin. The Bible's clear about that. But she was accepted into Israel because of her faith. Now, we talked about the care of maidservants last night, but I'll just raise again for those who were not here. One of the most amazing things you will find when you go through the book of Deuteronomy especially and through Exodus, Leviticus, is how often maidservants are mentioned. And especially when God is recounting the feasts and the Sabbath and the way people are to be treated, the maidservants are always getting a mention. Because they are the most vulnerable people. If you've read a lot about the Victorian life in England, you know what it was like for maidservants. They were vulnerable. They could be pressured by the sons of the house and the owner of the house to do all sorts of things. They rarely got time off. But in Israel, maidservants could not be mistreated. They couldn't be physically abused. They were not to be lusted after. They were specifically included in all the feasts and times of family worship. They were required to have the Sabbath day off. And the laws of release included maidservants as well. So there was tremendous care for the vulnerable maidservant. Now I want you to come to Numbers chapter 30. We're going to talk about the law of vows in Numbers 30. This is another one of the feminist targets. Because you know in Numbers 30 that when a vow was made, a man's vow was made, it had to be kept. A woman's vow, it could be overruled. And that, of course, upsets the feminists no end. You know, Numbers 30 is quite an interesting chapter. There's one verse concerning the vows of males and 12 verses about the vows of females. And why would God spend so much time about the females? Because he's balancing two things here. He wants women to make vows. He encouraged women to make spiritual commitments. He loved that they did that. But what God established in Genesis with the headship of Adam and what happened after the fall still had to be observed and remembered. So a father or a husband could override a woman's vow. It had nothing to do with a woman's dedication or ability to make a good vow. In fact, a lot of men made pretty dumb vows. Think of Saul's vow about eating on the day of battle that caught Jonathan up. It's got nothing to do with about the ability or the dedication of the woman. What it did is it said, even when you are making a vow, which was the highest thing you could do in serving God, you know, the peace offering had to be accompanied by a vow, the highest vow. When God did that, he still said, don't forget my order of creation. And so the husband or the father could overrule the vow. But you see, it wasn't a matter of him asserting his authority. What it meant is that when she made that vow and he approved it, he was also committed to that vow. You think of Hannah's vow with relation to the child Samuel. Give me a child. When he's of an age to go away from home, we're going to leave him in the temple under the care of the sons of Eli. That was a tremendous vow to make because of their desire to try and correct the state of Israel. But Elkanah was held to that vow because once he approved it, he was part of it. So it was actually making the man and woman work together on making a vow that they totally both agreed and could support. He couldn't later on say, you stupid woman, why did you do that? Couldn't do that. He was responsible for the decision because he was now part of it. The proof of what I've just said, when you come to verse 9, every vow of a widow, or her that is divorced, where they've bound their soul, shall stand against her. So a woman who was not in a relationship with a man, either in her father's house or in her husband's house, she could vow freely without anyone telling her that her vow was not acceptable. And you see, that's the proof that the divine order was to be respected as part of the process of vows. It's not about the woman being put under the man. It's about respecting the divine order that God established, even in this matter. This is why Paul says in the 1 Corinthians 14, when he says there, I suffer not a woman to teach, as also saith the law, to be in subjection. And this is the law that he's referring to. That here in the matter of the highest form of worship, God still required the observance of the divine order. Proof is that the widow could make her own decisions. You see, that's why we need to read the Bible very carefully. So when we come to women in worship, I want you to come to Exodus chapter 34. I'm going to show you a verse which probably you've seen before, but I just think this is the most wonderful verse in many parts of the book of Exodus. You know, Exodus 34 is the context of the glory of God being revealed to Moses as he stood there in the cleft, and the pronunciation of the name of Yahweh, the character of God, all that was done in Exodus 34. And you think, well, what could be the next important thing after that? Well, we're going to talk about women in religious services. Again, I'm going to show you the protection of God for the vulnerable. They could be Nazarites. As we said, you end up your Nazarite vow taking the hair to the altar with your own hands, so you become a priest in that day. Even when the lepers are cleansed, God says whether male or female is being cleansed from leprosy. In the feasts, they went up as families. You know, we know that Mary and Joseph went as a family every year to the Passover. And sometimes it was not possible for women to go. That's why the law said only males have to go to the 3 feasts a year. There might have been a young baby. There were other physical reasons women might not go. Males were under a law, but women were not. But look at Exodus 34 and verse 24. And I said, bear in mind the seriousness of the context we're dealing with here. It says this, verse 22, you shall observe the feast of weeks, the first fruits of wheat harvest, and the ingathering. For I will cast out the nations, or thrice in a year in verse 23, you shall appear before, your men children shall appear before Yahweh God of Israel. And I will cast out the nations before thee and enlarge thy borders. That's what happened to Jabez, wasn't it? I'll enlarge thy borders. But look at this. Neither shall any man desire thy land when you go up to appear before Yahweh thy God thrice in a year. Think of this scene. You live in the valley of Sorek. You're on this side of the mountain. On the other side are all the Philistines. You've just finished the harvest. I mean, 2 of the 3 feasts were at the conclusion of the harvest. You've loaded your barns up with all the things that come. It's the time when kings go to war, says the Bible, the end of harvest, because there's plenty of plunder to be had. You imagine the scene, and the Philistines are watching you across the valley, and all the menfolk, all the able-bodied men from 12 years old and upwards go off to Jerusalem. And all that's left behind is a bunch of really old men and women and children. And the barns are full. How would you feel as a woman in that situation? Or if you had a bunch of Amalekites camped down the bottom, how would you feel? Well, God says, you go to the feast, menfolk, and no man will desire your land. You know, I have a tremendous time sitting just thinking of the fun the angels must have had sorting out the enemies of Israel. And they would be saying, oh, good, they've all gone, the men have gone, we can go and grab everything out of their barns. You can just imagine, as I said, the fun the angels had. No man will desire your land, says God. Why? To protect the barns? To protect the women. What a beautiful law that was. You see, God says, you're going to worry about leaving your womenfolk behind. Think of Gad and Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh that left their womenfolk on the east of Jordan amidst conquered enemies for 7 years while they worked with their brethren to conquer Canaan. And none of those women and children and herds were taken because of that particular promise. That's why it's in this context. Put me first, says God, and you watch. But he says, I know what you think and you care about your womenfolk. I'm with you on that one. You know what a beautiful law that is? Now come to Numbers 5. The law of jealousy is another target of the feminists. The feminists would say this is terrible. The woman's put on trial, something she didn't do probably. She's got to drink this horrible dusty water made of ashes. It's a terrible thing. Well, look at it the other way. Why did God make a law like this? You think if you're the innocent woman, how you feel. Your husband's made an accusation that you're committing infidelity, and there are no witnesses to that. It's only his suspicions, or maybe, it might be, he wants to get rid of you. And he's going to try and use the accusation of adultery to get rid of you. And as you know from this record, with her belly swelling up, it wasn't the dust that did it. God was saying, I will make the judgment in these cases. If she's guilty, it'll be proven in public, and she'll die because she's an adulteress. But part of that would have been a bit like Achan. You've got to make full confession. And the male would have been identified as well and put to death. So you see, it wasn't just about the woman being condemned, she would have had to confess who the male was involved. So you see, this is really about getting some justice. No innocent woman would fear the test. She knows that God's going to make the decision. She wouldn't be afraid of it. A woman who was guilty and her husband suspicious, she could go to him and plead for, say, look, I made a terrible mistake, I won't do it again. And he could show mercy. Look what Joseph was going to do for Mary. Put her away privately. He could have had her stoned. So she could have made that appeal for mercy from her husband and made a new start in the family. He didn't have to report it to the authorities. But if he went through this process and it was found that he was wrong, he would be humiliated and silenced. And at home he wouldn't be allowed to forget. You know, we brethren who make mistakes, we're not often forgotten, are they? And he wouldn't be allowed to forget at home about his false accusation. So this is for the protection of the woman. And let's make this little thing here to look at. In this context, in Numbers 5 and 6, this is another example of case law. This could very well have applied for both male and female. Look at Numbers chapter 5, the early verses. In verse 3, the leper, male and female shall be put outside the camp. In verse 6, when a man or woman shall commit any sin that men do. So this is about both parties being subject to this case law. The purpose of it was, in verse 31, then shall the man be guiltless from his iniquity, and the woman shall bear her iniquity. This is the guilty woman. So if the man's made a charge and it's proved correct, then he's not guilty of false suspicions, and she's guilty of adultery. But the whole point is that others would learn to fear. It's like when Ananias and Sapphira were slain. Great fear fell upon the ecclesia. People realised you don't fool around with God. But the advantage of this process was it took away the climate of suspicion and humiliation the woman was going through with these accusations being thrown around. Or what you see in the Muslim world is you have these honour killings where some girl gets involved with a man and the family go and kill her and the boy. Preserve the honour of the family. This was about sorting out who was right and who was wrong, but particularly to protect the woman from a false accusation or from the husband getting a cheap divorce. So this was about protection again. It wasn't about persecuting women more than men. Look at the ways that God protected women. You know, rape was punished by death, no exceptions, always the death penalty. Our enlightened society lets them out after a couple of years and they re-offend. Men were always counted as the guilty party. It's so different to Islam, isn't it, and other countries. In the ancient codes, the women were blamed. Where a woman was complicit in a sexual relationship, or it says there that where it says of the couple, they are discovered having a relationship prior to marriage, the man's got a choice. He either marries the girl or he pays a dowry to her father because she's probably less marriageable than she was before. So in a case of seduction, where both are complicit, he has to take responsibility. He's the one who's regarded as most responsible. Whatever he chooses to do, it's on him to make a decision that it takes the responsibility. Again, protection of the woman, being left with the damage. A man could just move on and say, well, tough luck for you. But this woman's now in a different situation. She's a different prospect for marriage under the Jewish laws about marriage. He's got to take responsibility for that, even though it was consensual. Marriage under the law. Polygamy was never part of God's plan. There's no Bible example of polygamy working out well. Always strife, unhappiness and jealousy came from it. No examples in the New Testament of it being allowed. In the law of Moses, there was only one case where God said, I will put a law above the one man, one wife principle. It's the law of inheritance. That rare case where a woman is left childless, her brother can take her, make her a second wife and raise up a seed to take over that inheritance. That's the only case, and it rarely happened. It possibly was the case of Mary and Joseph, but it was a very rare thing. God always encouraged men to have one wife as the best way to live, the wife of your youth. That relationship was something that God wanted to happen. And within families, there was very strict control of sexual relations, very regulated. You know, when you wade through those chapters in Leviticus, how unseemly they are. But they're there because it happens, brethren and sisters. Human nature can be a plague in areas of sexual matters. So does God repress women? Well, there were wonderful laws for women. No polygamy was encouraged except in that isolated case of inheritance. If a man had two wives, that was in the prescribed situation of having two wives through inheritance matters, the husband had to avoid favouritism, especially in matters of inheritance. He couldn't say, I'm going to leave all this inheritance to my children or I'm going to discriminate. He had to be absolutely fair to follow the law when it came to division of property. In the first year of marriage, husbands were exempted from military service. which ensured the raising of a godly seed. A new wife has left her tribe and she's moved to another tribe amongst people that she's got to get to know. She needs his support in that first year. Those of us who have had children who moved interstate in marriage know that that's always a challenge. They have to try and assimilate into a whole ecclesial environment they don't know. They need their husband with them. Again, protection of the vulnerable. He wanted marriage to be enjoyed. He says, I want this man to stay home and enjoy his married life. What about marriage choices? Well, no laws were given about arranged marriages in the Bible. It was a fairly common custom in ancient times and still in many countries today. The daughters of Zelophehad, who made 2 changes to the law of Moses, they made 2 additions to the law of Moses by their faith to be inheriting with Abraham. But the last one was with a restriction. To preserve the tribal inheritance of Manasseh so that it didn't go and get split up to other tribes when they married somebody else, God said, you can marry anyone you like. You can have free choice of the partner you choose, but it's got to be in the same tribe. How sad today in some religions, not just Islam, but the Mormons, particularly the branch of Mormons. Very young girls are forced into arranged marriages, so they become the first wife, third wife, 15th wife. I think Brigham Young had 20 or 30 wives. And some of them start at the age of 12, 13 years. That's happening today. They have no choice. And yet God said, you can marry anyone you will, but in the same tribe. In our case, of course, the same tribe is the believers. What about the fatherless and the widows? There must have been many widows given all the wars and the losses in war. Those families were provided for out of the tithes and the first fruit offerings. It was the first state-organised welfare system for the poor and the widows and the fatherless. And God said, don't you ever dare oppress the poor, because I'm watching them. My anger will rise up quickly if you oppress widows. And the great and terrible God executes the judgment of widows, protecting the vulnerable. That's what God's about, isn't it? So, does God repress women? No, God raised the status of women in Israel to a level not known in any ancient culture and far in advance of many modern cultures in our supposedly enlightened world. He cared for and provided for the defenceless, and women in Israel were protected from many of the abuses they still suffer today. Brethren and sisters, and particularly our young women, we say this: the law of God loves to protect the vulnerable, is very much aware of the needs of women, and he provided for them in every way in his law. And the Lord Jesus Christ continued the goodness of God towards women. He healed women. He spoke directly to women. He taught and personally encouraged women, something the rabbis had got into this way. They wouldn't even speak to a woman. They wouldn't be seen in presence of a woman. Totally wrong. He went around Israel with a team of women in support. Totally unconventional approach in those days, to be travelling with 12 or 13 men travelling with 8 or 9 women. But they did it, and I did it respectfully and morally. He broke all the extremes the Jews had applied. When the Lord was raised, you go through the record and see who he first appeared to. It was to Mary Magdalene. It was to the other women that came to the tomb. And there was one that was missing. One of the faithful women was not in Jerusalem anymore. And he goes to the road to Emmaus. And I believe to Cleopas and his wife, who'd been at the foot of the cross. She was Mary's sister-in-law. And the Lord goes out and he finds the last of the women before he goes to the disciples. Because he valued the fact that they understood that they'd given of themselves so much to support him. And they became very valued members in ecclesial life. They received the gifts of the Holy Spirit in the first century, including the gift of prophecy. Because that was a foretaste of the kingdom. And in the kingdom they will have all the gifts along with their male counterparts. So God gave them the gift of prophecy. Nothing strange about that. But they had to use it, as we find in Corinthians, according to the order that God had set in place in Genesis. There were restrictions upon the use of the spirit of prophecy. So you see, God is always balancing his laws, one against the other, putting some things always not to be forgotten, but always protecting women and honouring women above most other religions in the world. So let's just summarise. Not one clause oppresses or belittles women. Husbands exempted from war. The mother has to be honoured as much as the father. Tight regulation of divorce and polygamy. Inevitable death penalty for rape. Captured women had to be protected from rape. Equal access to the whole sacrificial code. Maid servants included in the family worship. Maid servants protected from abuse. Women could serve in the temple. People like, we know with Anna was in the temple day and night. Perhaps Jephthah's daughter was there when Samuel arrived. But they could serve in the temple. Property inheritance for orphan daughters. Equal opportunity to become Nazarites and to offer with your own hands on the altar. The gift of prophecy given to women as well as men. Exodus 35, you read it. Collecting for the tabernacle, voluntary giving, willing giving. Male and female, male and female, male and female. All the way through the chapter. Let male and female give. Because God wants us to give to his service. And there are no laws about being totally veiled in public in the Bible. So is God a moral monster? He chose one people. He requires total commitment in response. He's not changed his values. All of his laws had a natural benefit for mankind. He loved Israel. The Canaanites had to go for their sake. There was no slavery like that of the 17th, 18th, 19th century. The status of women was raised incredibly. His laws are just and clear, providing deterrence to crime and thoughtlessness. And it's God that sets the laws of the world, not wicked men. So let us honour God's ways, brethren and sisters. The law is holy, the commandment holy, just and good. The law of Yahweh is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of Yahweh is pure, is sure, making wise the simple. The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of Yahweh is pure, enlightening the eyes. So don't listen to the atheists and the skeptics, brethren and sisters. I'll just put this up for a few moments for you to think about. I believe in a just and holy God, the resurrection, a day of judgment, and a reward of eternal life. But all the atheists scoff at me. Well, if I am wrong, I will never know. But if they are wrong and I am right, then the atheists may be in for a most uncomfortable encounter before the God they have so blatantly misrepresented. Thank you.